extraordinary story with you. I'm really excited for you to get to meet Gladys Aylward. Her story is really something. It's filled with adventure and perseverance and courage and danger. Mostly, though, it is the story of one woman's great faith and her God's great faithfulness. And that's what I hope you take from this class. As I said, it's the story of Gladys Aylward. It's the first in our summer series, 8 champion reformers of the 20th century. And I think that's such a great, it's got such great cohesiveness with the theme that we're following in church with our sermon theme, which is God is faithful for this summer. That's our theme. And I think you're going to see that quite clearly in the lives of all of these reformers that we cover during these talks. These people who said yes to God's call really experienced God's faithfulness. And that, I think, can teach us a lot, because God calls each one of us to something. And how do we answer that call? How do we live out that call? Maybe this will help us kind of identify some of those spaces in our lives. I announced a little bit before, but I don't have a PowerPoint. There were handouts, and maybe you can even pass them around after you've had a chance to look at them. Because in them there's a timeline, there's a map, and there are photos of Gladys, of the inn, and you would maybe get a better sense of where she was and who she was. As we go along, feel free to ask any questions or make any observations. But for now, I'd like to open us up with a prayer, and it's actually a prayer we said on Father's Day here. It struck me as we were praying it that I needed to pray it here. So let's open with this prayer. Oh God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Amen. Well, how many of you have seen the 1950s movie, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness? Oh, a lot. So whether you know it or not, you know a little bit about Gladys Aylward. I will say that they stripped most of the Christianity from the movie, and we're going to make up for that here. But there were so many more highlights in her life that were just extraordinary, just extraordinary. Her life is littered with examples of God's faithfulness, His provision, and His care. I think you're going to see how the obedience of one woman, one ordinary woman, and she called herself an ordinary woman, to God's call, led her to do the most extraordinary things. Gladys Aylward had very little to recommend her. She had no social status, she had no money, she had no education, she had no facility with languages at all. She had no connections. No connections. The only credential that Gladys had was that she was a willing child of God. Gladys was born on February 24th, 1902, to a London postman and his wife. She was one of 3 children, but even as a child, she was a tiny little thing with straight hair, dark brown hair, deep brown eyes, very tiny. She just never felt she fit in. We're going to talk more about that later. Hers was a Christian family, but as Gladys said in her book, The Little Woman, she became impatient. That was her word, impatient with religion. And she stepped away from it. At 14, she went into service, which was not an uncommon thing for working class daughters at that time. She became a parlor maid. But as she grew, she developed an ambition. And Gladys's ambition was to be an actress. So on her off hours, she went to dramatic classes. And it was there that she learned how to project her rather high-pitched voice, which, by the way, you can hear on YouTube, and to speak very clearly and with feeling. She did not have any idea how God would come to use that talent in later years, but he did. One evening, for reasons I can never explain, she said later, she attended a religious meeting and realized that God had a claim on her life. Gladys accepted Christ as her Savior, and she joined the Young Christian Life campaign. While reading one of the group's publications, Gladys learned that millions of Chinese had never even heard of Christ. I felt that surely we ought to do something about that, she said. She soon found that the other Christians around her were not at all so concerned. She repeatedly encouraged them to please go to China and tell people about Christ. She was always rebuffed. Bless you. Finally, she asked her brother to go. "That's an old maid's job," he said. "Why don't you just go yourself?" Well, why not indeed? Then and there, Gladys made two promises. "Dear Jesus, if you will show me the way, I will go. And I will never again ask someone to do what I believe you, Lord, are asking me to do." But how was she to get to China? Gladys asked around and soon heard about the Chinese Inland Mission Society, which trained missionaries to China. She gave up her parlor-maid job and entered the school, which she attended for 3 months. At the end of the term, the school's committee told her she could not continue. Her qualifications were too slight, her education too limited, and she had no facility with languages, and the Chinese language would be way too difficult for her to ever learn. She would never, ever be a missionary anywhere. Well, imagine. I mean, this was Gladys's dream, and her dream just evaporated. It just evaporated. What was she to do? She had no school to return to, no job. Well, the committee chairman suggested she serve as a housekeeper for 2 retired missionaries in Bristol, England. And that was a position that Gladys accepted. But her time at the college had not been wasted, she told the chairman, because there she had learned to pray. To really pray as I never did before. And I will be forever grateful for that, she told him. The time she spent with Dr. and Mrs. Fisher was critical to Gladys's future. They modeled implicit faith. They knew God as their friend. And Gladys was inspired by how they lived with him every day. God never lets you down, they told her. He sends you, he guides you, and he provides for you. Maybe he doesn't answer prayers as you would like them answered, but he does answer them. Remember, no is as much an answer as yes. Well, how am I to know if he wants me to go to China or remain in Bristol? Gladys asked. He will show you in his own good time, they said. Keep on watching and praying. Well, eventually Gladys moved on. She became what was called a reserve sister with the Christian Association of Women and Girls, and she tried to aid the young women who loitered down at the docks at Swansea. And she liked this job, and she felt good about it. She was able to tell people about Christ, and she was able to bring the young women to church if they would go on a Sunday. But Gladys never forgot China. I could not rid myself of the idea that God wanted me there, she said. Finally, she decided to go to London in hopes of acquiring a position with a family going to China. It was a fruitless trip. There was no job. There was no family. And everyone she spoke to was against the very idea that she would go to China. Dejected and depressed, she boarded the train back to Swansea. She looked at the Bible on her seat next to her. If I am going to preach about Jesus to other people, I better know about this book. So she started reading. Genesis 12. in which God calls Abraham to leave his country really spoke to Gladys. Here was a man who had left everything, his home, his people, his security, and gone to a strange place because God told him to. Maybe God was asking me to do the same, Gladys wrote in her book. Then she read the story of Moses. Here again was a man who did something on nothing. She was struck by his courage to defy Pharaoh and lead thousands of decidedly difficult people out of Egypt. But Moses had to make the move. He had to leave his quiet home in the desert, Gladys observed. This was a very important realization for her. If I wanted to go to China, God would take me there, but I would have to be willing to move and to give up what little comfort and security I had. She took a job as a parlor maid in the London household of Sir Francis Younghusband. Don't you just love that name? A British Army officer and an explorer who had spent time in China, among other places, and his library of books on China would provide valuable information for Gladys. On her third day on the job, she was sitting on her bed reading the book of Nehemiah. His weeping and mourning over the overwhelming need of the people in Jerusalem really resonated with her, for she felt that way about the people in China. But like Nehemiah with Jerusalem, she felt she could do nothing about it. And then she got to the second chapter of Nehemiah and realized he had gone to Jerusalem. He went, in spite of everything, she realized. This is Gladys's account of what happened next. Gladys Aylward, is Nehemiah's God your God? Oh, yes, of course. Then what did Nehemiah, do what Nehemiah did and go? I am not Nehemiah. No, but assuredly, I am his God. Gladys had gotten her marching orders. She put her Bible on her bed and dumped out all of her money, which amounted to 2.5 cents. Then she prayed, "Oh God, here's my Bible. Here's my money. Here's me. Use me, God." Minutes later, her mistress rang for her. Her practice was, she said, to pay for her maids' transportation costs when they came to work for her. She asked Gladys how much it had cost to get from Edmonton, where she had been living, to London. 2 shillings and 9 pence, Gladys responded. Then take this 3 shillings, her mistress said, dropping the coins into her palm. In a matter of minutes, Gladys's meager means had grown by 3 shillings. It was a start. To raise money for passage to China, Gladys began working dinner parties on her off time, and she'd get £1 or so. She banked all of it. She checked out costs to go by ship, and the least amount was £90.
Whoa.
Well, woof is right. Pretty overwhelming. The cheapest alternative was via the Trans-Siberian Railway, a trip that would take her through Europe, through Russia, through Siberia. The cost, £47, 10 shillings. The clerk at Muller's travel agency tried to dissuade her. There was, he said, a war going on in Manchuria, and she might never even arrive in China. And Muller's preferred, he said, that their customers arrived alive. Gladys put the £3 down anyway that she had saved. She calculated it would take her 3 years to raise the fare. But by autumn, because of what she called in her book, miraculous little happenings, she had paid the fare in full. There was a problem. Where would she go when she got to China? She wasn't being sent there by anybody. There was nobody there that she knew. The answer came in an event at her mother's church. A woman there told her about Mrs. Jeannie Lawson, a 73-year-old missionary who'd been there about 50 years, and she needed some help. "Oh, that's me," said Gladys. 3 months later, after corresponding with Mrs. Lawson, Gladys, at age 30, set out on her 5,556-mile journey from London to Tientsin, China. She wore an old coat into which her mother had sewn secret compartments for her tickets, her passport, her Bible, her fountain pen, and her 2 traveler's checks, each one worth £1. Because she had no money to spend on food, she carried a suitcase filled with edibles, crackers, cookies, tins of corned beef, tea, and various other things. In an old army blanket, she toted a few clothes, a bedroll, a tea kettle, a saucepan, and a small spirit stove. It was October 15, 1932. Her new life had begun. And now, if you would, if you have a packet, you can take a look at the map that's in there. And I'd like to invite you, as we move along, to mark where you see God's hand in Gladys's journey. And we'll discuss that later. Excuse me. Gladys had to journey to Holland to get the Trans-Siberian Railway train. And on the trip over, a couple joined her compartment, and they befriended her. The wife was English, and the husband was a member of Dutch Parliament, and they were coming back from a holiday in England, to The Hague, where they lived. Gladys told them she was on her way to China to tell people about Jesus Christ. And as they were about to part, the woman said to her, "My dear, I am going to make a pact with you. For as long as I live, every night at 9 o'clock, I am going to pray for you. I want you to write your name in my Bible, and let me write mine in yours. And if we never meet again on earth, someday we will meet in heaven." Well, we can never know the effect that those prayers had on Gladys's life, but we know who heard them. As they parted, the man grasped Gladys's hand. "God bless you very richly, my dear," he said, "and keep you ever near to him." It wasn't until they left that Gladys realized that the man had pressed a £1 note into her palm. She hid it in one of the secret compartments in her coat. Days of monotonous travel went by. Gladys couldn't speak the language, she could only speak English. And so, how could she converse? So it was pretty lonely. On October 22nd, though, they crossed into Siberia. On the 24th, a man who spoke a little English, which was very exciting for Gladys, joined her in the compartment. He told her that because of fierce fighting between now the Japanese and the Russians, the train wasn't running to Harbin, China, where she was to change whole railways, actually, change trains for the Manchurian Railway, get on a train there, which would take her to Harbin. She would likely, he said, be stopped at the border. The Russians did try to get her to leave the train at Chita, where all the other passengers disembarked. But Gladys was determined. Her ticket was all the way to Tientsin. So she remained on the train with the Russian soldiers. The train traveled all day and into the evening, finally stopping that night. Russian soldiers tumbled out, leaving Gladys alone in the car. She heard gunshots. They weren't very far away. And she realized that she had really reached the end of the line. Gladys left the car and sat on the train platform. It was freezing, bitterly cold, and there was a wind. She was uncertain, though, of what to do. "Oh, Lord, is it worth it?" she cried out. The response came in a flash. "Be not afraid. Remember, I am the Lord. Gladys found a hut where 4 men, the guard, the porter, the fireman, and the station porter, sat drinking coffee. They offered her coffee, and through pantomime indicated that she would need to walk all the way back to Cheetah to take another train and another route. Well, warmed at least temporarily by the coffee and the blazing stove in the hut, Gladys gathered her belongings and began the trek back to Cheetah. After midnight, she was so exhausted, she moved off the track, ate a bit, and slept wrapped in her coat on her luggage as it snowed on her. Dogs howled in the distance. Years later, she would learn they were packs of wolves. It took her nearly 2 days to reach Cheetah. When she did arrive, she was overwhelmed at the misery and the filth of the people. An official spotted her and carted off all her luggage after searching most of her secret compartments. He left her only with her coat and her Bible. Gladys was petrified. She was nearly ill, and she was freezing cold. She tried to read her Bible, holding it up to a dim light. A piece of paper, torn from a calendar that she did not recognize, fell out. "Be ye not afraid of them," read the writing on the paper. "I am your God." Gladys was questioned for days before the Russians finally issued a new visa, gave back her luggage, and told her to take the train to Nicholshisser Junction, where she would get on yet another train that would eventually end up in Harbin. But when she reached the next stop, you guessed it, no train to Harbin. The Japanese had closed in. Once again, Gladys slept in a train station. In the morning, she spotted someone who was not a Russian soldier. "Can you please tell me how to get to Harbin?" she called out. Amazingly, he responded in English. "Go to Vladivostok." Gladys pushed her way onto a train, the second one, headed to Vladivostok. Once there, she sought the help of the tourist agency. The interpreter was friendly, taking her passport to be stamped, and then leading her to a hotel, and then he took her on a tour of the town. But Gladys was appalled at the squalor, at the long lines of people waiting for black bread, the emaciated women toting huge babies and big bundles. Days passed. Gladys had not gotten her passport back. Frequently, very frequently, she asked about getting it back so she could continue on her way. But her questions were always deflected, until finally one day, the interpreter asked, why did she want to go to China anyway? She could work in China, in Russia. They needed workers in Russia.
Yeah.
Well, she was a missionary, she said. She was not going to stay in Russia. But the conversation greatly worried her, and she left her hotel and walked to the seashore. Suddenly, a young girl came alongside her. "Who are you, and what do you want?" Gladys asked. "That does not matter," the girl replied in English. "You need to leave this place. If you don't get out now, you will never leave. The authorities have no intention of letting you go." She told Gladys to return to her hotel room and get ready to leave. When an old man knocks at your door, be ready to follow him. Do not ask any questions. She disappeared then, leaving Gladys in a heightened state of anxiety. Could she trust this girl? What was to happen to her? Gladys returned to her hotel room, and soon there was a knock on the door. It was the man who had taken her passport, the interpreter, and who now held it in his hand. He seemed somehow menacing to her. Gladys grabbed the passport and flung it straight over her head back into her room. "You are not coming in here," she proclaimed boldly. "I am the master. I can do what I wish," he said. "Oh, no, you cannot," Gladys said. "You may not believe in God, but He is here. Between you and me, God has put a barrier. Go. Can you imagine? The man shivered and hurried away. Gladys opened her passport and was horrified at what she saw. It had been altered. Instead of missionary, Gladys was now identified as a machinist. She had her confirmation. She needed to get out of Vladivostok. Sometime after midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. Gladys opened the door to find an old man standing there. Without a word, she gave him her suitcase, and she took her bundle and tea kettle. They walked silently down to the docks, where he left Gladys in a little shack. Suddenly, the young girl appeared again. Gladys needed to get on the ship. A Japanese boat anchored at the dock, the girl said. "But I have no money," Gladys said. "Then throw yourself on the mercy of the captain. Plead with him. Beg him to take you. You must get on that boat at all costs." She pointed to a hut. The captain was there. And the girl vanished. Gladys approached the captain and told him she needed passage to China, but she had no way of paying. Well, he could not take her on board as a passenger if she could not pay, he said. Gladys showed him her obviously altered passport. He noted that she was a British subject and obviously in trouble. Would she put herself under his protection as a prisoner? Gladys agreed. But as she was going up the gangplank, Russian soldiers grabbed her. She was able to fling her luggage and the bundle onto the deck of the ship, and then she suddenly recalled the pound note that the Dutchman had pressed into her palm. She pulled it out of her compartment in her coat. "I buy myself off," she shouted, and threw the note. And spellbound by the fluttering note, the Russians let her go. And she leaped onto the boat just as it pulled away, and one Russian soldier was left holding a coat sleeve. After some days, the boat reached Japan, and Gladys was handed over to the British Embassy. They housed her for a little bit, and they bought her a ticket to Kobe, Japan. From Kobe, she would travel to Tientsin, and there she hoped Jeannie Lawson would be awaiting her. 5 days later, on November 10th, Gladys arrived in Tientsin. She had made it to China. "Praise my soul, the King of Heaven," Gladys sang. Before we go any further, let's look back at Gladys's journey. Where do you see the hand of Gladys on her trip? Any thoughts?
I would say 5,546 miles of the journey.
Right. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? As I was doing this, I realized I just could not do a PowerPoint. This is just not bullet points. This is about faith. I think the moral of this story so far, at this part, is that sometimes God takes us on a circuitous route to get us where He wants us to go. The call of God doesn't mean smooth sailing and no problems. The call of God is, after all, to a particular work. And not just that, but to a stronger faith. And even when we can't see the way, God is putting in our way building blocks to build that faith. And I think we can see that in Gladys. When she got despondent, when she despaired, when she worried, when she was afraid, God responded to her every time. Every time. So, any other thoughts?
When you say boat, it's a ship.
It's a ship. True. Thank you. From somebody who knows.
I was a deck
Thank
boy
you.
once myself.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Well, on with the story. Gladys arrived in Tientsin, but Mrs. Lawson was not there because Mrs. Lawson never expected Gladys to arrive. Instead, Gladys learned, Mrs. Lawson was in a walled city called Yangchen, miles away in the mountains. 6 days of travel via train, bus, and mule finally brought Gladys to Yangchen and Mrs. Lawson. It had been 5.5 weeks since she had left London. The old missionary had taken up residence in an inn, a dilapidated structure on the main road that was empty and very cheap, 30 cents for rent a year. It was scarcely attractive, Gladys remarked in her book. The gateway led into a huge courtyard from which doors in various rooms opened up on all sides, but the whole place was littered with fallen masonry, bits of paper, and other rubbish. Gladys's room had a window, but there was no glass, and there were no curtains. There was also no door. Mrs. Lawson advised her to sleep in her clothes. A good thing, because word apparently got around the village, and the next morning when Gladys awoke, every window in the place, including her own, was filled with curious faces, period. You can see, if you have a handout, you can see on the first few pages of the photos, Gladys with Mrs. Lawson, and also the inn as it is now. The inn is still standing. I don't know that it's changed a huge amount since Gladys was there. And on the next page you'll see a motorcycle, and that actually is a picture of the old road that went through when Gladys was there. While Mrs. Lawson journeyed to nearby villages to preach the gospel and had a little money of her own, and that paid for food and the negligible rent, the Canny Scott had a larger goal. She wanted to turn the place into an inn for muleteers to stay, because the inn actually was on an ancient caravan road. And every night, the town was filled with caravans of muleteers staying the night. So, Mrs. Lawson felt that if she and Gladys would feed the muleteers, and as they ate, Mrs. Lawson would relate the story of Jesus, the muleteers would come and they could spend the night on these kangs, and they were long, high brick plateaus almost, that covered the whole wall of a dormitory. And there were 3 such dormitories in the structure. So on those kangs, they could house 50 people a night. And the idea was that when the men left in the morning, they would take the story of Jesus with them. The gospel would be spread, Mrs. Lawson said. So propelled by this dream, Gladys and Mrs. Lawson set about cleaning up the inn. They fixed the roof, they made the place habitable, and they hired a cook named Yang. They came up also with a name for the place. The Inn of the 8 Happinesses, said to be based on 8 virtues: love, virtue, gentleness, tolerance, loyalty, truth, beauty, and devotion. When they were finally ready to open, Gladys, who was trying very hard to learn the region's dialect but had really not mastered it yet, discovered what she was to do. She was to pull the mule trains into the courtyard. Gladys was to stand outside the courtyard entrance, shouting in the bit of Chinese that she knew from Yang. She had learned it from Yang, the cook. "We have no bugs. We have no fleas. Good, good, good. Come, come, come." Then, as the lead mule drew near, Gladys would grab hold of its bridle and drag it in. The other mules would follow. The plan worked. Mrs. Lawson and a Mr. Liu shared storytelling duties. Gladys sang hymns to the guests and scraped mud off the mules. The muleteers spread the word not only about the foreign ladies and their clean inn, but about the stories they told. On Sundays, the women went to the nearby villages to preach. Fear of the foreign devils, as they were called, was overcome by curiosity as the town women gathered around them to feel the cloth of their clothes and also lift their skirts to see what was on underneath. But the most fascinating thing to them, to the townswomen, was the foreigners' feet, because they were considered quite large in China. At that time, women had bound feet, and so large feet were a curiosity. At the end of 1933, Mrs. Lawson, who had been ill pretty much throughout that year, became quite seriously ill, and there were no doctors nearby, so Gladys nursed her. Just before she died, Mrs. Lawson told Gladys that she wanted, that God wanted her to carry on her work. He will provide, she said. He will bless and protect you. Mrs. Lawson had lived just long enough for Gladys to be reasonably prepared to carry on the work. By now, she could understand the language and speak it very well. She could also write it. She would become as fluent as a native in that language. With Mr. Liu's help, she kept the inn going and even held services there. She traveled to the villages, bringing what medical aid she could and preaching in the marketplaces. But it soon became apparent that there was not enough money coming in to keep the inn going. Gladys herself had no money, so she didn't have that little cushion that Mrs. Lawson had. And so what was she to do? Was she to go back to England? Was it time for her to leave China? She prayed fervently for an answer, and God sent one. One day, the Mandarin of Yangchen, akin to kind of a governor of a province, came to see Gladys. He needed her help, he said, because she had big feet. This puzzled Gladys until the Mandarin explained that the government of China had issued a decree banning the binding of feet. The Mandarin was being held responsible for ensuring that this ban was enforced. He needed a foot inspector, a woman with unbound feet. He needed Gladys. The ban pleased Gladys. Oh my. She had been horrified at this practice, which involved women binding the feet of their baby girls when they were aged 2 to 3 to prevent their feet from growing. Small feet were considered beautiful in China, and the smaller the better. You can see photos of women with bound feet in shoes in your packet. You can see them unbound that were bound on the internet, and I just could not put it in your packet. The practice completely crippled women. It cruelly forced their toes under the pads of their feet. And eventually the nails grew into the pads. So you can imagine how incredibly painful that would be to try to walk. In the packet, you'll see a shoe that it's very pointed at the end. It's 3 inches long. 3 inches. So this was a very brutal custom. For becoming the inspector of feet, Gladys was to be paid a farthing and a measure of millet each day. Gladys had had her prayer answered by God, but first she had to be sure of one thing. "I will do as you wish, Mandarin," she said, "but you understand that I have come to China to preach about the God I worship. If I inspect the women's feet, I shall use that opportunity to preach in all the lonely villages," she told him. The Mandarin agreed and left after promising Gladys he would send soldiers with her to enforce the ban as needed. Gladys fell to her knees and praised God. His message was clear. She was to stay in China. As I look back, I am amazed at the way God opened up the opportunities for service, Gladys wrote. I had longed to go to China, but never in my wildest dreams had I imagined that God would overrule in such a way that I would be given entrance into every village home, have authority to banish a cruel, horrible custom, have government protection, and be paid to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ as I inspected feet. The Mandarin gave Gladys a Chinese name, Aylward, virtuous woman. She soon became known all over the province, and Gladys knew that she had finally found her people. Like her, they were small, with dark eyes and straight, dark hair. She fit in. In 1936, she became a naturalized citizen. Her official Chinese name was Aylward. Years later, she would reflect, God didn't send me to Africa because he knew I wouldn't fit in. He didn't send me to the slums of London because he knew I wouldn't fit in there either. He sent me to the middle of China because he knew I would fit in. In her time in China, Gladys had seen all kinds of things that to her were barbaric. The binding of feet, for example, and the routine public decapitation of those convicted of a crime. When she first arrived in China, she went out to the marketplace and came upon such a sight. And she was completely horrified and traumatized, actually, when a head rolled onto her feet. But among the worst was the selling of children, generally girls, who were considered negligible in Chinese culture. One day, on her way to give the Mandarin her report on foot inspection, she came across a woman sitting with a filthy little girl, ridden with sores and obviously ill. The woman offered the child to Gladys for half a crown, about 35 cents. Angry and appalled, Gladys took the woman to task. And besides, I don't have a half crown, she said. She left and continued on to the Mandarin's house, where she objected bitterly to the trafficking of children. You could do nothing, the Mandarin said sadly. Like foot binding, it would take a government decree to abolish that practice. On her way back home, Gladys saw that the woman and the child were still there. She just could not bear the inhumanity of it, the suffering of that poor little girl. So she dug around in her pocket and came up with 9 pence, which she offered to the woman. The woman grabbed the coin and shoved the girl into Gladys's arms. Gladys named her 9 pence. I think she had another name that meant beautiful grace, but she was called 9 pence. And with love and care, she thrived. Sometime later, 9 pence would bring an orphan boy home. He in turn brought others. And soon there were 20 children. Gladys now had an orphanage to run. As time went on, Gladys and the Mandarin became great friends. She talked to him about Jesus, about how Christians are to spread his love, visit those in prison, feed the hungry, clothe the poor. He listened patiently. This must be a strong faith of yours, Aylward, he said. Gladys was deeply touched when, sometime later, the Mandarin became a Christian. One day, Gladys was summoned to the prison by the prison governor. She needed to stop a riot, he said. The prisoners, murderers, bandits, thieves, they were rioting in the courtyard, and the soldiers were frightened of them. Gladys was stunned. How was she, a small woman, and women were not really respected in China at that time, how was she to stop a riot? These were very strong, rough men. Some of them had swords, and who knows what they had in there. She refused. She said no, she would be killed if she went in there. Oh, but she must go in, the governor said. She preached so much about this God of hers. Surely he would keep her safe. Well, as Alan Burgess recounts in the situation in his book, The Small Woman, based on interviews with Gladys, the governor said, if you preach the truth, if your God protects you from harm, then you can stop this riot. Well, Gladys could not let her God be humiliated because she had no courage. She entered the prison courtyard. A scene of carnage greeted her. There was blood everywhere, and so many men, some injured, some dead, some still battling with each other. One man, a blood-stained, fierce-looking fellow, held a large chopper and looked menacingly at her. "Give me that axe," Gladys demanded in a loud voice filled with authority. And here comes the dramatic classes. They paid off. After a few tense moments, he handed it to her. She shouted for all the men to line up in front of her. Surprisingly, they did so. Then she asked them what their grievances were. Nobody answered. I think they were too afraid. Gladys told them to appoint a spokesman, that who could relate their complaints to her. And so as the men cleaned up the courtyard, Gladys listened to the spokesman. And she learned, as she heard him, that the men were excruciatingly bored and frustrated. They had absolutely nothing to do. So, with the blessing of the prison governor, Gladys set about to make that happen. I'll give them something to do. Soon the men were using old donated looms and yarn to make puttees, a common clothing in the area. They were grinding grain on a miller's wheel. They bred rabbits for sale. But they needed most of all to know about Jesus. So Gladys came often to the prison, and she told the Bible stories, and she told them about Jesus. And over time, some convicts, including the axe bearer, became Christians. In 1938, the Japanese invaded China. Gladys's courtyard often became crowded with wounded soldiers, whom she and a battery of others tried to help, even with their very meager supplies. There were no hospitals, there was no Red Cross, so they still tried with whatever they had to help. And one day, as Gladys was leading the morning service, Japanese planes flew over, silver streaks dispensing bombs, one of which hit the mission house. Gladys was dragged out from the rubble sometime later, battered and bruised, but she continued to aid the injured. And it was the first of many such days. For Yangchen was actually on the battlefield itself, and it changed hands all the time. But Gladys soldiered on, evangelizing, and sometimes she entered villages occupied by the Japanese, but they never bothered her, she said. And some even came to her meetings. Because she was able to move around freely, though, Gladys was soon asked to pass on information about the Japanese movements. And she did this. "I suppose I was a spy," she would write, "but I was Chinese, and the Japanese were our enemies. They had despoiled our country, disturbed our way of life, and killed our friends. The war continued mercilessly. Children whose parents had died in bombing raids and others who had been abandoned found their way to the house of Aylward, for they had heard that she would care for them. When the Japanese would retake the town, Gladys and her by now 100+ children would take refuge in caves or remote villages, begging food from everyone just so they could eat a little. It was becoming increasingly dangerous to be in Yangchen. A Chinese general who befriended her told Gladys about Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who with government money had opened orphanages in free China. Gladys wrote to her, asking her if she would take the children. Madame Chiang responded, if Gladys could get the children to Xi'an in Shenxi province in free China, she would take them. And she would send money for Gladys's work in Yangchen. It was decided that Mr. Liu, who had been assisting Gladys, would take the children on the arduous journey. They would travel on the old roads through the mountains, then cross the Yellow River and continue west to Xi'an. It should take 2 weeks, and Mr. Liu would be back in a month. Well, the inn was empty. Mr. Liu set off with the 100 children and as much food as could be spared, which wasn't very much. They would have to beg or buy on the way. The inn was empty of children for only a short period of time because the children kept coming. We had more than 100 before the month was up, Gladys recalled. Chinese officials repeatedly asked her to leave. Gladys's answer was always the same. Christians do not retreat. But one night, a soldier came to her and said it was urgent that she leave. There was a price on her head, 100 pounds offered by the Japanese High Command. The flyers were all over the place. Gladys was a wanted woman. How could she leave the children and the others she cared for? Gladys prayed to God for an answer. I opened my Bible, she wrote years later, and the first words I heard saw were, flee ye into the mountains, dwell deeply in hidden places, because the king of Babylon has conceived a purpose against you. Jeremiah 49:30. That was all Gladys needed. The next morning, before dawn, after she had alerted the people in the inn that she was leaving, she ran through the gate of the dead, across a stream, and into a field. Suddenly, Japanese bullets were streaking by. She tore off her padded coat and rolled under a bush. Eventually, the shooting stopped. Gladys lay there for a time, her coat riddled with bullet holes, but finally she got up and made her way for refuge in a friendly but remote mountain village. It was clear to her, though, that she must get the children out of Yangchen, and it would be her. She had not heard from Mr. Liu, even though she had gotten word that the children had arrived safely in Shenxi province. She would later learn that he had been captured on his way back by the Chinese, who did not believe his story about the children and imprisoned him as a Japanese spy. So it would be Gladys to get the children out. Some days later, with enough grain to reach the next town, Gladys set off with more than 100 children, ages under 3 to 16. And except for the first 2 days, Gladys was the only adult. Their route had to be changed from that of Mr. Liu, because the Japanese now controlled every road. So they would have to go over the mountains and then get a boat, and this would be a boat, across the Yellow River and continue on to Sian, more than 100 miles. If you look on page 5 of your photos, you'll see a photo of some of the children just before they left. The journey was perilous. Food was scarce. Villagers helped as they could, but their stores were very, very depleted. The travelers had no blankets. Thin shoes wore out on the very rough terrain. Gladys and the older children carried the younger ones on their backs, and Gladys herself often did not eat so the children could eat. I tried everything I could think of to distract their attention from their aches and pains and to keep them trudging on, Gladys wrote. We would sing hymns and choruses, all that we knew. Sometimes I would start with a text like, bless the Lord, O my soul. And the children would reply, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. It used to bring a lump to my throat and tears to my eyes to hear the poor little mites sing, count your blessings, when at present they had so few blessings to count. After nearly 2 weeks, they spotted the Yellow River. When they finally reached the village on its banks, it was deserted. The town had been evacuated. Some soldiers told her because the Japanese were expected any day, and the soldiers could spare only a little food for the children. Gladys and the children sat at the riverside for hours and hours, waiting for a boat to come that could take them across the river. None came. Finally, she sought out the military headquarters. Again, she told her story. Again, there was no help for the children. For the first time in her life in China, Gladys lost heart. If only I wasn't saddled with all these children, she thought. Nobody else bothered with them. Why did I have to get myself and them into this mess? And then a voice said, I died for these children. I loved every one of them. I gave them to you to look after, for my sake. Point taken. Another night passed. In the morning, Susanne, a girl of 13, asked Gladys if she recalled when Moses took the children of Israel through the Red Sea on dry land. Gladys nodded. Do you believe it? Susanne asked. Of course I do. I would not teach you something I do not believe. Then why don't we go across? I am not Moses, Gladys replied. Well, of course you are not, but Jehovah is still God. Gladys later described that conversation as a physical blow. What happened to her faith? She had always staked her life on God's mighty power, and why should she doubt it now? Suddenly, a large man, a Chinese officer, appeared before her and inquired what they all were doing there. Waiting to cross the river, Gladys said. But the boats had been taken off the river, so the Japanese would not have access to them, the official told her. Gladys introduced herself, told her story, and said, "It is imperative that I get these children across the river to safety." The man raised his arm and hollered, and a boat appeared. It took loads of children over until they all were safely across the river. For the next few days, the children stayed in the homes of villagers, and they were fed reasonably well and slept well, slept better anyway. And then they set off to Mienchen to get a train to just within a few days' march of Zion. But the train did not go as far as they had thought, for it would pass too close to the Japanese lines. Once again, they would need to walk over the mountains to a town with a train going toward their destination. But how were they to continue? Everyone was exhausted. They had no food. They had no shoes. They had nothing. They had been on the road now for 20 days. The soldiers would help, they were told. So the next day, Gladys and the children set out, following a faint mule track, scrambling over loose rocks and sliding down steep slopes. Without the soldiers, Gladys would say later, many of the children would never have made it. But when they reached the town, there were no trains. It was too dangerous for them. One of the officials, though, had an idea. A coal train did go through every morning before dawn. Perhaps Gladys and the children could go on that train, but they would have to be very quiet. If the Japanese heard voices, they would shoot at the train. Still, it was a chance to safety, and Gladys grabbed it. Before dawn the next day, Gladys and the older children took the younger ones and positioned them, they were still asleep, interestingly enough, between lumps of coal on top of the coal cars on the train. And the children were so exhausted, they did not awake. They reached their destination without incident, although they were covered in coal. Only 3 more days of walking, and they would reach Zion. But when they got there, the city gates were closed, and the officials refused to open them. Gladys hunted around the villages and finally learned of a Buddhist temple at Fufeng, one of Madame Chiang's orphanages. It was a day's journey by train. And Gladys, who by this time was malnourished and quite ill, got the children and herself on the train. She would never recall that journey. She would never recall getting children safely to the temple. Eventually, she would end up in a hospital in Zion, but no one really knew who she was. They assumed she was a Chinese woman. It wasn't until Mr. Liu, who had been released from prison, was brought by a pastor to see her that her identity became known. Diagnosed with typhus and pneumonia, Gladys remained in the hospital for months until the doctors felt they could do no more for her. And Gladys could never clearly recall the next 2 years. She could not walk when she was released from the hospital, but she spent time in a mission in Fufeng where she was lovingly nursed and could see some of her children. They were in an orphanage there. And eventually she went to live in the back of a factory with 14 of her children. And at that time, the children were older and they could help with expenses. And she also was working with some other people to establish a church there. As her health improved, she returned to evangelizing, but her health was fragile. She ministered in a leper colony and a prison, but finally around 1949, 1950, she returned to London, and likely it's because of her health. Some accounts said she needed an operation, but in any case, she was in ill health. She raised money and clothes for Chinese refugees in Taiwan as she got better, and she sought to help the growing Chinese population in England. She would teach them the language, she would write notes for them, she would raise money and clothes for them too. But Gladys yearned to return to her people. She could not go back to China, however, because it was communist by then and they no longer welcomed missionaries. So Gladys went to where her people were, Hong Kong and Taiwan, where thousands of Chinese had fled the communists. In Hong Kong, she founded a mission. In Taiwan, she established an orphanage. She traveled through England and even to America on speaking tours to raise money for the charities. Eventually, they would be funded by World Vision. It was in Taiwan that Gladys died on January 3rd, 1970. She was nearly 68, but her life had been full. Her work had been fruitful, and her God had been faithful. In reflecting on her life in China, Gladys once noted, "I wasn't God's first choice for what I've done in China. I don't know who it was. Must have been a man, a well-educated man. I don't know what happened. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he wasn't willing. And God looked down and saw Gladys Aylward. And God said, well, she's willing." So that's Gladys's incredible story. And what it says to me is that none of us is ordinary when we partner with God. Together we can do the most extraordinary things.